There's a moment recorded in the archives of the Velthari hegemony that their historians simply call the stillness. It was not a battle. No fleet was destroyed. No world burned. No weapon was fired. It was a smile. One human, one smile. And the most decorated military analyst in Velthari history walked out of the briefing room, sat down against the corridor wall, and did not speak for 3 days. This is the story of that smile, of what preceded it, of what followed, and of the slow dawning, ice-cold realization that crawled through the hegemony like a plague, silent, invisible, and utterly unstoppable. The realization that by the time they saw the smile, the hunt had already been over for years. They just hadn't known they were the prey. The Velthari had been watching Earth for 47 of their cycles before first contact. 47 cycles. Long enough to map every major population center, every communication frequency, every orbital pattern of every piece of debris and raw satellite humanity had flung into the dark. Long enough to run 17,000 simulations of contact scenario. Long enough to translate, with near-perfect accuracy, the primary linguistic structures of 6 of humanity's most widely spoken languages. They were thorough. They were patient. They were, by any reasonable galactic metric, excellent. The hegemony had encountered 31 sentient species in their long history of expansion. They had uplifted 8, subjugated 11, absorbed 9, 3, had destroyed themselves before contact could be formalized. The Velthari knew exactly how this worked. They had a playbook. They had protocols. They had entire bureaucratic divisions dedicated to the management of newly discovered civilizations. What they did not have, what none of their 31 prior contact files had prepared them for, was us. Senior contact analyst Vane Seroth was the one who opened the file on humanity. She was considered one of the finest minds in her generation, a scholar of civilizational development who had personally overseen 3 successful uplift procedures. She had looked into the eyes of species that worshipped star, species that communicated through chemical secretions, species that had no concept of individual death, and therefore no concept of fear. She had seen things that had reshaped her understanding of consciousness itself. She was not prepared. The file began, as all files did, with the threat assessment index, a simple numerical score from 0 to 100, measuring the potential danger a newly discovered species posed to hegemony interests in the short, medium, and long term. 8 was the highest score ever recorded, assigned to the Kethvral, warrior caste species from the Outer Rim that had taken 40 years, and a significant military campaign to bring into the fold. Most species scored between 1 and 3. Humanity scored a 4. Vane Seroth had flagged it as anomalous but manageable. 4 was notable. 4 warranted careful handling. 4 did not warrant alarm. She would later revise her opinion of the scoring system entirely. The first live surveillance feeds from Earth were, on the surface, unremarkable. A species in the mid-industrial phase of technological development, transitioning rapidly into an information age. Bipedal, bilaterally symmetrical, surprisingly diverse in coloration and physical variation for a species that had achieved planetary communication. They built cities. They grew food. They argued constantly with one another through glowing rectangles. Standard. Then the behavioral analysis team submitted their report. Vane Seroth read it once and put it down. Then she read it again. Then she summoned her team led a grizzled veteran named Drosval, who had been doing this work for longer than she had been alive, and she slid the report across the table to him. He read it. He was quiet for a long time. "Run it again," he said. "The behavior modeling. Run it again from scratch with a different team." "I already did," Vainsara said. "Twice." Drosva looked at the report a third time, as if hoping the numbers would change. They did not. The humans played. This was not, in itself, unusual. Several species in the hegemony's files exhibited play behavior in their juvenile stages. It was a recognized developmental mechanism, a way for young organisms to practice adult skills in a low-stakes environment. Perfectly normal. Perfectly expected. What was not normal? What was not expected? What had, in fact, never been recorded in any hegemony contact file in all of their long and comprehensive history of meeting new minds was this: the humans never stopped. Adult humans, .2. Fully mature, sexually reproductive, occupationally active adult humans, the same ones who built infrastructure, raised offspring, and managed complex social hierarchies, played constantly, obsessively. They invented games of such elaborate complexity that entire careers could be dedicated to mastering them. They played games that simulated war, games that simulated economics, games that simulated the construction of civilizations. They played games with no competitive element whatsoever, simply for the experience of the game itself. They played games with their children, with their peers, with strangers on the other side of the planet. And here was what kept Drosval up at night. Here was the line in the behavioral report that he highlighted and circled and stared at until the words blurred. The games humans play most obsessively are hunting simulations, not resource gathering, not territorial defense, not social hierarchy management, all of which were the standard categories that other species play behavior, mapped onto hunting, died out. The humans had not needed to hunt for survival in many of their population centers for generations. They had industrialized food production to a degree that made individual hunting ecologically negligible, and yet they played hunting games with a frequency and intensity that their own psychologists, humans studying, humans described as near compulsive. They built digital worlds for the sole purpose of moving through them and finding targets. They played hide and seek with their young children, a game which, stripped to its core mechanics, was nothing more than a predator practicing how to locate. They watched videos of other humans hunting for entertainment. They read novels about hunters. They named sports teams after predators. They kept in their homes as beloved companions the domesticated descendants of one of their planet's apex predators, and then threw objects for those animals to chase and retrieve over and over again, watching with evident satisfaction every single time. "They're not playing," Drosval said finally, his voice very quiet. "They're training." "That's one interpretation," Vainsara said carefully. "Is there another one?" There wasn't. Act 2, the deepening. The decision to proceed with contact was not made lightly. The Hegemony's Expansion Council debated for the better part of 2 cycles. The behavioral report had made its rounds. Opinions were divided. The moderate faction argued that the hunting behavior was simply an evolutionary artifact, a vestigial instinct no more threatening than the appendix, a remnant of a path that no longer defined the species. Humans had, after all, built a civilization. They had art, God. They had philosophy. They had elaborate systems of ethics that they argued about constantly and loudly, which was, if anything, a sign of moral development rather than predatory intent. The conservative faction argued that the hunting behavior was precisely the point. That a species which had built civilization while retaining the full psychological architecture of an apex predator was not a species that had transcended its predatory nature. It was a species that had found a new way to express it. The compromise was a surveillance extension, another 12 cycles of observation before any contact decision was finalized. It was during this extension that analyst third-grade Pelvas made his discovery. Pelvas was young, junior enough that he had been assigned to what was considered the least interesting portion of the human data catalog, their historical records. Eternal, old conflicts, ancient wars. Due, the sort of archival material that told you where a species had been, not where it was going. Necessary for completeness, not expected to yield anything new. Pelvas was thorough, because he was young and still trying to prove himself, and so he did something that none of his seniors had done. He mapped every armed conflict in human history, every war, every battle, every recorded military engagement, going back as far as the historical record reached. And he built a timeline. Then he calculated the frequency. Then he sat back in his chair and stared at the ceiling for a very long time. Humans had been in a state of significant armed conflict somewhere on their planet for approximately 94% of their recorded history. Not sporadic outbursts separated by long peace, not occasional territorial disputes that flared and resolved. Continuous, overlapping, multi-front, multi-party armed conflict generation after generation after generation for thousands of years. And then he looked at what had happened in the most recent cycles, the period that the analysts had been observing, and he found the second number, and he found the second number. The second number was the one that made him request an emergency meeting with Vainsara. They stopped, he said, when she arrived. She looked at the data. Reduced, she corrected. Global scale conflicts have reduced significantly. There are still regional. No, Pelvas said. He pulled up the full scope of the timeline with the reduction highlighted. Look at the scale. Look at the time scale of that reduction. Vainsarath. What? In 60 years, they reduced the frequency and scale of their internal conflicts by a factor that would have taken any other species in our files at least 300 years to achieve, if they achieved it at all. She looked. How? She asked. They got bored, Pelvas said. That's the working theory from the sociological team. They had access to the hunting simulations, the games, and the games were good enough, stimulating enough, that the psychological drive that used to express itself in actual warfare started expressing itself in simulated warfare instead. What's up, fam? The room was very quiet. They redirected a species-wide predatory drive. Vain, Saraf said slowly, into entertainment. And they did it, Pelvas said, in 60 years. She looked at him. He looked at her. They were both thinking the same thing, and neither of them wanted to say it out loud. So Pelvas wrote it in the report instead. If they can redirect a predatory drive of this magnitude by choice in 60 years without external pressure, what happens when they choose to redirect it? Outward? The report was classified. Immediately, at the highest level, the surveillance extension was extended again. Contacted. First contact with humanity was ultimately not initiated by the hegemony. That, too, was unprecedented. It happened because a Velthari scout vessel experienced a navigational malfunction in the outer system and drifted quietly, without power, running cold to avoid detection into a debris field that turned out to be rather more actively monitored than their charts had indicated. A human deep space telescope array noticed them inside 40 minutes. 40 minutes. The Velthari scouts had been using their most advanced passive concealment protocols, not because they expected to need them. Cold drifting in an outer debris field was about as inconspicuous as it was possible to be, but because protocol was protocol, and Velthari scouts followed protocol. The concealment protocols had to date made them effectively invisible to every other species they had ever encountered. Humanity found them in 40 minutes. But that wasn't the part that made the report. The part that made the report was what happened next. The humans didn't broadcast. They didn't send a signal. They didn't convene a global committee to discuss the appropriate response to apparent extraterrestrial presence in their outer system. They didn't panic. They didn't even issue a general announcement. 3 days after the telescope array flagged the anomaly, a small spacecraft, fast, efficient, minimal emissions, running what the Velthari would later understand was a very effective electronic countermeasure suite for a species at humanity's technological level, arrived at the debris field. It just showed up, quietly, and began to circle. The lead scout, a veteran named Thresh Koval, watched it on his instruments with mounting disbelief. No hailing frequency. No visible weapons array. No broadcast of any kind. It simply circled, slowly, methodically, as if it was taking measurements. Because it was taking measurements. "They're scanning us," said his co-pilot. "Yes," said Thresh Koval, without announcing themselves. "Yes, that's..." The co-pilot searched for the word. "That's what we do." Thresh Koval thought about that for a long moment. "Yes," he said. "It is none." He made the decision to power up and hail them, primarily because the alternative, sitting there while a human spacecraft quietly learned everything about his vessel's hull composition and energy signature, seemed worse. The response from the human craft was instantaneous. A voice, calm and professional, in one of the languages the Velthari had translated. A simple acknowledgement. Coordinates for a rendezvous point. B. Yeah. And then, before Thresh Koval could formulate a response, something that wasn't in any of the briefings. A question. "How long have you been watching us?" Thresh Koval stared at his communications panel. His co-pilot stared at Thresh Koval. "They know," the co-pilot whispered. "They suspected," Thresh Koval said. "There's a difference." But when he met the humans at the rendezvous, a formal contact delegation, assembled with remarkable speed, professional in bearing, equipped with translation, technology that shouldn't have existed at their developmental stage, the first thing the lead human did was shake his hand, an odd physical gesture that the briefings had flagged as a greeting. And then she smiled. And Thresh Koval, decorated veteran of 31 contact operations, experienced something he had never experienced before in his career. He felt watched. Not observed, not studied, watched. The way he had felt once as a young scout when he had been moving through an alien jungle on a survey mission and had suddenly become aware, between one step and the next, that something in the undergrowth was tracking him, that there were eyes on him that had been there long before he noticed, that he was not and had not been the one in control of this encounter. He smiled back because the briefings said smiling was reciprocal, and he reported back to Vane Sarath that contact had been made. And then he wrote. Inti wrote his personal log, a single line. They already knew we were here. They were waiting for us to make a move. Act 4. The briefing. D. The formal debrief of the first contact event was held at the Velthari hegemony's primary Analysis Center, with the full behavioral and strategic assessment. Teams present, but Vane Sarath chaired it. Rosval sat at her right. The room was full of the finest minds in their contact division. The lead presenter was a young analyst named Shen Va, who had been assigned specifically to reconstruct a timeline of human awareness to answer, as precise as possible, the question that had been haunting every senior analyst since Threshkoval's report. Not, when did the humans find out, but how long had they known? Shen Va had been at it for 6 weeks. She was visibly exhausted. She stood at the front of the briefing room, looked out at the assembled experts, and took a long breath. There is a principle in human strategic philosophy, she began, that I want to use as a frame for this presentation. In one of their oldest military texts, a human strategist wrote that the supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. I want you to keep that in mind. What? Why do? She pulled up the first slide. The Velthari surveillance program began 47 cycles ago. In human time, that is approximately 200 years. For the first 160 years of that surveillance program, there is no evidence that humans were aware of it. Standard detection, probability. Nothing unusual. No. She advanced the slide. 40 years ago, 40 human years, something changed. We can see it in the data, in retrospect. A sudden, coordinated shift in how certain research programs were funded. A reorientation of several space agencies' long-range detection priorities. A series of academic papers published in obscure journals theorizing about methods of detecting passive surveillance by technologically superior civilizations, and then, crucially, not publishing any follow-up work. The theories were there. The papers were there. And then they stopped. No. The room was very quiet. They didn't stop because the research stopped, Shenbaya said. They stopped because the research went somewhere it didn't need to be published. She advanced to the next slide. It was a simple timeline. 2 parallel lines. One labeled Velthari surveillance. One labeled human detection probability. For 160 years, the human line was flat. Baseline. Nothing. For writing obvious where it come to you at, but no, purely. Then it began to climb. Based on our reconstruction, humans achieved high-confidence detection of our surveillance program approximately 28 years ago. D. She paused to let that sink in. They have known we were watching them for 28 years. The room erupted. Vane, Sarath, let it run for a moment, then called for quiet. 28 years, Drosval said. His voice was very flat. They knew for 28 years, and they said nothing. They said nothing, Shenvaye confirmed. They just went about their business. They went about their business while we were watching. While you were watching, and while they were watching, you watching them. She pulled out the next slide. This is where it gets interesting. The slide was a comparative analysis. Velthari's surveillance data cross-referenced against human public broadcasting, human research publications, and, most disturbingly, human entertainment media. Over the 28 years since probable detection, Shenvaye said, human popular culture underwent a significant and consistent shift. The volume of stories, films, games, and other narrative media depicting first contact with extraterrestrial life increased by 400%. The nature of those stories also shifted. 40 years ago, the dominant narrative template for alien contact was an invasion scenario, a threat to be defended against. 20 years ago, the dominant template shifted to a diplomatic contact scenario. And then, in the last 15 years, she paused. The dominant template became a hunting scenario. The silence was absolute. The most popular entertainment properties in the largest human media markets for the last 15 years have centered on a single premise. Shen Va's voice was very steady. Humanity discovers that it watched. Humanity determines the identity and capabilities of the watcher. Humanity decides, on its own terms, when and how to make contact. She looked out at the room. They weren't processing a fantasy. They were rehearsing. Indeed, Drosval stood up. He was not a demonstrative being. He had, in his long career, maintained his composure through situations that would have broken lesser analysts. He stood up, walked to the door of the briefing room, opened it, and sat down against the wall in the corridor. He did not come back for 3 days. The smile. Vane Sarath finished the debrief without him. She went home that night and stood on her balcony for a long time, looking up at the star field, and she thought about the human delegate, the first one, one who had met Thresh Koval at the rendezvous, the one who had smiled. She pulled up the surveillance footage from that meeting. High resolution. She watched the moment of the handshake. She watched the smile. She had seen that smile in the data before, in the behavioral catalogs, in the sociological analysis. She had read all the clinical descriptions of human facial expression. She knew that the smile was, in its origin, a submissive display, a visible exposure of teeth that had evolved from a threat grimace, repurposed over millennia into a signal of non-aggression. She knew this. What the clinical descriptions had not adequately conveyed, what no amount of footage and data and behavioral modeling had quite captured, was what it looked like when it landed. Because it landed on Thresh Koval's face like a blade, and she could see it happen in real time. She could see the exact moment her veteran, decorated utterly unflappable field agent, felt it. The slight change in his posture, the almost imperceptible stillness, the recognition. He had recognized it. And now she recognized it. The smile of the human delegate was warm and genuine and perfectly calibrated, and behind it, clear as starlight to anyone who had spent the last decade studying human behavioral data, was something else entirely. It was the smile of something that had spent 28 years watching, waiting, and learning. Something that had known, long before the meeting, exactly who was in the room and exactly what they were capable of. Something that had chosen this moment, this setting, this exact exchange, had let the Velthari scout drift cold and quiet into the debris field, had let them sit there for 3 days before making a move, had calculated precisely when to reveal that they knew, and precisely how much to reveal. It was not the smile of a species meeting its first alien contact. It was the smile of a hunter who has been watching the trail for a very long time and has finally decided to step out of the tree. Vane Sarath sat down on her balcony. She thought about the first threat assessment. The 4. She thought about Pelvas's report, the classified one, the one about redirected predatory drive. She thought about the games, the simulations, the hunting simulations obsessively played across every medium by hundreds of millions of humans who had, apparently, also been, in some collective, uncoordinated, entirely organic way, practicing. She thought about the 28 years of silence, the patience of it, the extraordinary, almost geological patience of a species that had discovered alien surveillance and said nothing, did nothing visible, and simply continued to watch back. For 28 years, she thought about what kind of species does that. Not a panicking species, not an aggressive species charging blindly forward, not an oblivious species ignorant of the game, a species that saw the game, understood the game, chose to play the game on its own terms, chose to wait until it knew enough, chose the moment of its own reveal. A species that had, in short, looked up at the stars and thought, something is watching. Good. Let it watch. We'll be ready when we need to be. Her communication terminal chimed. It was the Expansion Council. They wanted her recommendation on how to proceed with contact formalization. She stared at the terminal for a long time. Then she wrote her response. Recommend proceeding with all standard diplomatic protocol. Recommend immediate revision of the Threat Assessment Index. The current score for the subject species is 4. Recommend revision to 47. Recommend accompanying notation. Score is speculative. The subject species has, as a first contact, demonstrated comprehensive surveillance awareness, patient strategic concealment, deliberate timing of first contact reveal, and behavioral architecture, consistent with an apex predatory intelligence that has successfully redirected its primary drives into cultural and technological expression. We do not know the full scope of their preparation. We do not know what else they were doing while we were watching. We do not know what they chose not to show us at the show. Rendezvous toi. We know what they chose to show us, a smile. We should proceed accordingly. She paused. Bah. Then she added one final line. I have reviewed the first contact footage 47 times. I want to note for the record that the human delegate's smile, at the moment of handshake, contained the full knowledge of everything I have described above. She knew we had been watching. She knew that we knew they had been watching back. And she smiled anyway. I am recommending this score revision, not because I believe humans are hostile. I am recommending it because I believe they are something considerably more dangerous than hostile. They are patient. They are prepared. And based on every available indicator, they have been looking forward to this. She sent the report. No. Then she closed her terminal, went back to her balcony, and looked up at the stars. Somewhere out there, she knew, humans were doing the same thing. And smiling. The formal first contact protocols between the Velthari hegemony and humanity were completed over the following 18 months. They were, by all observable metrics, successful. The human delegates were warm, intelligent, curious, and disarmingly funny. Humor being another behavioral characteristic, the pre-contact analysts had flagged as unusual, and which in person turned out to be considerably more unsettling than the clinical descriptions had suggested. The hegemony's diplomatic staff found them, almost universally, deeply likable. This did not make anyone feel better. Vain Sarath's threat assessment revision was adopted. The score of 47 stood for 11 years, until a follow-up analysis commissioned after the hegemony's intelligence division discovered that humanity had been running their own independent surveillance program on Velthari border systems for approximately 15 years, prompted a further revision. The new score was classified. The analyst who produced it requested a transfer to a different department immediately upon submission. In the official historical record of the Velthari hegemony, the entry for first contact with humanity ends with a single observation contributed by Dross Vale in the last year of his career, when he was finally asked to write the official summary. He wrote, "We came to assess them. We found, in the end, that they had already assessed us. Whatever score they gave us, they kept to themselves. We consider this, on balance, a mercy. And somewhere on earth, in a small apartment in a city that the Valkyrie surveillance satellites had photographed 11,000 times. Over the course of 47 years of watching, a woman sat at her desk, looked out her window at the night sky, and smiled. She was not, as far as anyone could determine, thinking about anything in particular, but she was smiling. And somewhere in a Valthari analysis center, watching the feed from that same satellite that had watched her city for longer than she had been alive, a junior analyst watched her smile and felt, for reasons she could not entirely articulate, the sudden and overwhelming urge to check that all the doors were locked. She checked them. They were. She went back to work. The human kept smiling.